firstly, I'd just like to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining for today's webinar, which is going to be on implementing environmental and social impact assessment, ESIA, what ESIA practitioners need to know about translating ESIA into action on the ground. So we're pleased to be joined by our speaker today, Adrian Mill. Based in Dakar, Senegal, Adrian is Managing Director of ESS, a leading implementation-focused ESG and sustainability advisory services firm servicing Africa and emerging markets. So as always with our webinars, there will be a chance for questions at the end of the presentation. So please do submit these into the Q&A box in Zoom throughout the session. This will be at the bottom of your screen. And then I will ask these on your behalf later on. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today, and I will now hand over to Adrian.
Thanks so much, Joe and the IES team. Really pleased to be participating in this webinar and leading it. My name is Adrian Mill, as mentioned, the Managing Director of ESS, which stands for Environmental and Social Sustainability. We do what it says on the tin, as we say in English, which is essentially focused on implementing these different subjects, which are not limited to just environmental and social subjects, on the ground in emerging markets and making sustainability happen where it's needed most. I see a few people in the participants list who I already know, many people who I don't, so really looking forward to sharing with new and old friends a bit of insight on the ground. As Joe mentioned, I'm based in Senegal. I will quickly introduce myself. I come with more than 20 years of experience in ESG, sustainability, HSEC, health, safety, environment, and communities, from before even these were called these things, or when they just started to be called. So I am getting on. I set up ESS about 3.5 years ago to respond to a big problem as I saw in an emerging markets context, which was there's a huge amount of ESG problems being faced in an African context, and yet not enough people on the ground with the skills to deliver it. And I thought, how is the best way to make those people come into existence and train them, given that international consultancies and various other ways of doing this have not been very successful to date. And I hit upon setting up ESS and a learning by doing sort of approach. And the way we do things, and I talked about implementation focus, we don't do ESIAs. We manage them, but ESIAs fall within a larger sort of field. And so with that, I'll click forwards, if it lets me, onto who ESS is. Obviously we manage ESIAs. ESS as ourselves are based in Africa. We only hire people in Africa, and we're constantly hiring people, and we love to have people come and join us on the continent. I myself am very soon going to become African, Senegalese. I've applied for citizenship and I'm waiting to receive that. And it just goes to show that the potential and opportunity on the continent and emerging markets in general is vast, exciting, and something that is worth being present for. And I hope if there's one thing you go away from this meeting, it's not just this webinar, rather, it's not just that how to think about the bigger picture when it comes to ESIA, but also that emerging markets are where the fun and the action is, and you don't need to be doing it from your desk in a nice Western country where everything seems to work moderately well, or at least relatively well compared to here. It's be here and be part of that, and hopefully encourage you to do so. I mentioned that because it's not just Africa now. We've just started offering our services in Central Asia. And really the key here is to bring up that next generation of ESG leaders in Africa and emerging economies. And that's what ESS is designed to do. So with that background on where I'm coming from and sort of what ESS does, bearing in mind also that I have had many, many roles over my 20+ years of career, including being the HSEC manager, Health, Safety, Environment, Communities manager for a $1 billion IFC financed bauxite mine project in Guinea, Republic of Guinea in West Africa. I've worked with investors. I've worked with, I've worked as a consultant. So I've been on the ESIA side of things, and I've actually was involved in what is considered by some people to be one of the better ESIAs in a West African context for a gold mine here in Senegal. And so I've had, I've been through the best of it and I've been through the worst of it. So I've seen it from all the different perspectives. And one thing I've come away from in my time is that even within the ESG industry, as it stands now, everyone on here who's an ESG professional and those who are not, we don't talk to each other in the same language. We don't even sometimes know what the difference is between the various different aspects of what we do. So when I talk about I usually talk about three things, and I've got ESIA there as a fourth one, but the three different topics I mention constantly is ESG, HSEC, and sustainability. And so what is the difference, and how do they relate to ESIA? So HSEC and ESG are referring to more or less the same thing, which is managing risk and ensuring compliance. And so that is a key thing to remember. If I get something wrong with health and safety or environment and communities, if I get something wrong with ESG, there are laws which I have to respect, and there are investor standards which need to be respected, and I can lose my finance as a best case scenario. At a worst case scenario, people can die, and or the people in the company can go to prison, there can be big fines, or the whole company can be shut down. So it's important to realize that that's what risk and compliance means. It's very much, if you get things wrong, there are grave consequences. Sustainability, however, is a more aspirational perspective. When I say aspirational, there's still the same problem, but it's at much larger scales. It's at a global scale, and companies are not necessarily the ones who are going to solve the problem. So, the big frameworks for HSEC and ESG are like the IFC performance standards and equator principles. But for sustainability, we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And of course, with the Sustainable Development Goals, like the first one is no poverty. Well, a company can't comply with no poverty. It can contribute to, and so that's what companies need to consider in a separate sort of vein of activities, how they're contributing to the larger and the bigger picture, things like greenhouse gas emissions and things of this nature. It may eventually become risk and compliance, but right now that's how it sits. And so when you look at the actual flow of information, HSEC is on the ground. It's the whole project cycle. It's having management systems, and we call them an HSEC management system. You may have heard of them as an ESMS, Environmental and Social Management System. Maybe it's another one called the Health and Safety Management System. We usually put this together. We say HSEC is a department. It's managed by an HSEC manager, and under them, there may be people who manage each individual aspect of health and safety, environment, social and communities issues, others potentially. And so the HSEC team are managing things on the ground, and they're creating that data, they're generating data. ESG is at a higher level. So ESG is talking about reporting and broad trends. An ESG manager might be managing multiple operations of a company. So we have a mining picture in the background, so I'll use a mining example. Maybe there's a mining company based in London, okay, in the UK, and they have projects in 4 different countries in West Africa, okay? So they would have an ESG manager who will help to manage to help to make sure that they're respecting the international standards, same standards, but they're not on the ground generating the data. They're taking that data and they're reporting on it. They're doing sustainability reporting and so forth. Now, obviously, we talk about sustainability reporting, and I just said that under ESG. Of course, I'm trying to simplify something that is vastly complicated. So please excuse me for having a go, but also understand that there is overlaps, okay? But broadly, what I'm saying stands. Similarly, the sustainability aspect, it can be managed by someone else. You could have a sustainability manager, or the ESG manager could manage that issue. But the issue as it stands itself is for a slightly different audience. It's for different framework, different reference framework, the SDGs and others. And it's the targets are self-selected or often. So if I want to be, zero emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, I choose that as a company or as a leader of a company. And it's the job of the team members who represent these particular things to advocate for the strongest and most, forward-looking and way of essentially business model for the company. So sustainability often is about how the business model of the company is set up, right? If it's designed in a way, for example, if the mining company in question had set up a project in a national park, well, clearly that's not going to fix either risk or compliance or sustainability. And so it's up to us to say, look, this particular project is a non-starter from day one. So ESIA fits into that as it's part of the HSEC overall approach, in that an HSEC manager will need to manage that process. Of course, they can't do it because normally an ESIA firm needs to be accredited within the country where it's operating. Often when there's international and national ones involved, there is a collaboration to make sure that it meets international standards. And sadly, in emerging markets, the national consultancies often, not always, but often find it difficult to meet those, or to understand how to report to those international standards. It is improving, but it's obviously still the case in many countries. And so the ESIA comes in during the feasibility phase, and it's a regulatory process. It's a legislative requirement to complete these things based on the type of project, etc. And there's baseline data, there's assessment and so forth, and mitigation to be identified. So taking that into account, HSEC ESIA sits as part of the HSEC ESG sort of portfolio of activities. It's one of many, right? But thinking about HSEC risks, what are the drivers? And many of these things you would have seen over time. You might have heard of, regulation and compliance and access to finance, operation risk management, reputation, being a differentiator of your business, cost reduction, thought leadership, doing the right thing in general. But the ESIA and ESMP, while arguably it does cover all of these things, it's mostly focused on these two, regulation and compliance and operational risk management. Whereas HSEC implementation starts before the ESIA starts, and it goes all the way through to operations and eventual closure. While the ESIA covers these phases, it's not necessarily taking a thought leadership position or setting out how a company can differentiate itself in the market by being as green as possible. So that's something to take away from this. So ESIA sits at a particular part of the project lifecycle. What you see here is the project lifecycle. And as you can see, there's from conception of the project, so coming up with the idea and then doing the studies, the feasibility and so forth. And then eventually when you've got the money, constructing it, operating it, and then potentially it might operate in perpetuity, in which case closure doesn't apply, or you might expand the project. A mine, as I used as an example previously, they will run out of things to mine eventually, unless they expand and they do more exploration. Of course, a mining company has an exploration period that's not really drawn on here, and other entities have different potentially parts of it. But broadly, this is the process. And so at project conception, this is the best time to start thinking about your corporate ESG approach. Not all companies do this. In fact, very few start off with this. They may say, oh, we plan to meet all ESG standards. Well, that's great. I plan on paying my taxes, right? Like, that's a law. You have to do that. Like, you have to do that. Whereas you can come up with that, but at the same time, to say I've got this strategy and this approach on ESG, you then need to start saying, right, these are the things I need to do. And that's when scoping comes in, that maybe gap analysis and needs assessment. And out of this comes the scoping. Obviously goes into the ESIA phase. It's part of ESIAs. While a gap analysis or a needs assessment is a bit more like a due diligence, right? And you can do that at any point in the project. You can start off right at the beginning and do these things. They serve the same purpose, because at the end of the day, it gives you a plan. But the gap analysis, is looking at beyond just the ESIA phase. It's looking at what management systems do I need now at feasibility, at construction, at operation? What other activities do I need to do? It's thinking about sustainability as well to a degree. So there's a lot of things under that heading. Of course, then the ESIA and that's associated ESMP are done during the feasibility phase because you need it legally to be able to start construction. It gets you your permit. Then an HSECMS is done. Of course, that should be ready to go from day one of construction. So that means starting it a little bit early, right? Which is why it sort of overlaps with that point of the feasibility. So it needs to be done early, and they take a while to do. For complex projects, it can be 6 months to a year to pull together all the management system documents and hundreds of thousands of dollars or pounds or euros, whichever your currency is. Point being, a lot to be done, and they change over time. Construction and operations do not necessarily have the same risks and therefore don't necessarily have to have the same management system. They need to be adapted. There's also a sustainability reporting component that comes over the top. So then we come back to ESIA. It's a multidisciplinary process. Those of you who work as ESIA consultants will know that and will often argue, well, it's very complicated. There's a lot of us to look at. And it's true. There's environment, there's biodiversity, there's health and safety, there's social and communities, there's corporate governance. All these things are thought of during the ESIA process. And it's a valuable process to go through. The main problem that most people pull up with the ESIA process is that it starts usually, and sadly, this is almost always the case, when the project already has done or has started to do the feasibility. People in the organization already know what they want to do, and now they're just ticking the ESIA box. Whereas realistically, it should start from as soon as possible, but then it costs a lot of money, and as soon as possible means you have to spend money potentially before you've demonstrated that the project's going to make money. It's a catch-22 problem, and there's no easy solution. So there's a lot of things that we have to think about under that heading to help these companies to make money, because don't forget, at the end of the day, if the company can't make money, there's no point in it doing this particular activity, whichever it is. So under each one, we have a lot of sub issues. And I often say that an HSEC manager is someone who has to manage pretty much everything except running the business. And as you can see here, there's things in green and things in red. The green ones are the things that need to be managed directly by the HSEC manager and have to be thought of during the ESIA process. But the red ones are things that need to be done as well but not necessarily are managed by or owned by the HSEC manager themselves. They might be managed by people underneath them, or in the case of, for example, HR, you've got a team that actually, an HR department which will deal with HR. You just come in and talk about, you need to align with these standards. And so the ESIA process will also think about many of these things. But obviously, the ESIA consultant, as soon as that ESIA is submitted, that's handed over to the HSEC department to implement. So what are the constraints? So the first one is, and I've sort of alluded to this already, the overall business case of the client is the key part of this. And often, as environmentalists or social specialists or even health and safety specialists, anyone working as an ESIA consultant, very few people have a business background. So it's hard for them to appreciate how potentially a recommendation could be quite onerous or potentially destroy the project. And as someone who lives here and soon will become an African citizen, we want development. We need development. Stopping development is not helping. Doing it properly in a way that's as green as possible and that properly and proactively mitigates and hopefully is net positive on its impacts is what we want and what we need to do. So some of the constraints to keep in mind in emerging contexts include logistics. Often we're told to do things which are just not possible, like the roads are completely terrible, so it's just impossible for us to expect things to be done quickly. There might be no railway or anything like this, so there's things like energy reliability, energy cuts out. It's all well and good saying you should have a solar project, but when you're in the middle of nowhere, right, with no one to maintain that solar project that's providing power to your project or to your activity, well, that's a very big, difficult thing to say. Well, there's no greenhouse gases associated, or there's fewer greenhouse gases associated with solar, so use that. Well, it needs to make sense from a business perspective as well. And of course, sometimes we can phase things so that it makes sense in that instance, but still, things like the local availability of technical equipment, customs as well can be difficult in emerging markets. It takes a long time to get things in, get things out. Local service providers, I mentioned, managing and maintaining things, but also for equipment. The availability of laboratories, sending things away to Europe or other Western countries takes a long time. And sometimes, our samples when we're doing baseline studies and so forth can denature during that period. So it's difficult as things we have to take into account. This is one of the things that ESS is designed to address, the availability of locally skilled and qualified specialists. And so one of the things I hope you take away from this is that there's a balance to be struck between saying, right, you need to do X, right? And saying, okay, this is the objective and this is the goal that we want to get to. Here are some options that you can investigate. There's a case for doing both, and trying to figure out which is the best for each one is part of the difficulty of ESIA. And so it's a thing we really need to take into account, especially in emerging markets, so that we can come up with creative and pragmatic solutions to those problems. Some of the challenges arising from implementation, from the mitigation measures, are that they don't that sort of contribute to not adequately addressing the risk. Include the following. There's often an overemphasis on the assessment without providing enough solution, or it's so broad and undefined that it's hard to understand. It's difficult because it's complex often, and the area, and sometimes it's difficult to understand the local context or even the activity of the company that's being studied. That we have difficulty in prioritizing and prioritizing actions in general to address. External consultant bias, I talked a little bit about that just then, but essentially the fact that if you are living in the UK and you've been a couple of times to Senegal, that doesn't make you a Senegalese expert, right? And even having people who are Senegalese and on the ground, you need to make sure that their points of views are appropriate, and because there's different tribes and different religions and different cultural contexts and so forth, and it's very challenging to match the right mitigation with all those different overlaying layers. A focus on compliance and tick boxes rather than, and with overly generalized statements, rather than really focusing on the real key points and how to actually address them. Cumulative impacts is just sadly one of the most underappreciated and underserved parts of ESIAs in general, and trying to do that appropriately in most cases difficult, but just having limited consideration of that is a problem. And then, of course, the fact that ESIA is essentially a one-time exercise, right? It does set out that there's long-term monitoring and required, but it's hard to, once you've handed over that document as an ESIA consultant, that's it, your job's done, right? Often companies will say, look, we'll keep monitoring for you. And of course, big in projects with category A as per the IFC sort of categorization process, projects will often have an independent environmental and social consultant doing that. But still, not all projects do, and not all of them do it well. And there's internal to the company and external to the company. So these all need to be taken into account. Looking at, I've got plenty of examples, but I'm running out of time. So I've just plot these on the screen. And the first one is a good example. Overemphasis on assessment, on this particular project, resulted in the ESIA overemphasizing technical and scientific considerations, essentially. And it wasn't really practical in terms of how those impacts would affect the environment and on just the perceptions of people in general. And so, in fact, that there was a failure to deal with that and to deal with that properly, and they had to redo everything, and it was a disaster in terms of environmental and social impact assessment. And there's lots and lots and lots of examples where things have gone wrong. Okay, and of course, some of that has to do with the ESIA process. Some of it has to do with after and before, but in any case, it's something that could have been captured by a strong ESIA process. So it might sound like I'm being overly critical on ESIA consultants, and please believe me, it's an important role and someone's got to do it and the law requires it. And everyone who does ESIAs is not a bad person, right? It's not that they're doing these things intentionally. The problem is time, effort, how much a client's willing to pay, etc. The ESIA consultants, and of course it's a team, it's not one person, it's a whole team of people who work onto it. However, need to think of the bigger picture because they sit within a bigger picture. And it's often really, really easy to, and I've done it myself, to lose track of that. And sometimes there's no one, and there's no HSEC manager or someone responsible for ESG in the organization you're dealing with. So you have no homologue, someone who does the same sort of thing as you in the organization that you can talk to, who can help you to understand how to fit it into that organization. So it's not sometimes the ESIA consultancy's fault or the consultant's fault. So taking into account it sits within a bigger context, the most important thing that an ESIA consultant can do is develop a robust ESMP. Okay, why is that? Because that's the thing that we go and look at. All the stuff that you write in the ESIA is just justification for the things you write in the ESMP as an ESIA consultant. So that means we take that one and we need to be able to implement it fast, because often it's just thrown at us and we've got to do, it's already too late. We have to start doing things. Work's already started, etc. So how do we do that? We have this, here's an example of a ESMP, okay? I'm not saying it's the best one, but it gives you an idea of the kinds of things are nice to see in there. And obviously we've had to redact things, so we haven't been able to put actual costs and things like this, and we've just provided a little bit of higher level things just for your reading pleasure. First one is provides actionable, measurable prescriptions in the mitigation measures, okay? Again, there's a thing here for measuring, but also there's a part here for budgets, okay? Not just the budget on the right-hand side, which is how much does it cost to do this thing, right? But sorry, on the left-hand side for doing this thing, but also how much does it cost to monitor this thing? Because monitoring has a cost and different entities have to do different things. So it's very important that those considerations are taken into account. The mitigation measures need to be concise but sufficiently detailed. I know we're asking a lot, but still, it's difficult for us to know, just looking at this document, it's difficult for us to know what you wrote in the rest of the document without going back to it. So here, it needs to be very clear what we have to do, and the logic needs to be clear as well. Of course, we assume the mitigation measure is logical, and that's a lot of what we do. Oftentimes, however, we find that they're not. I've been asked to do an influx management plan for a wind farm project in Djibouti, for example, where it's in the desert, there's only 2 villages, and even if you bring a lot of people there and they're staying in a construction camp, they then go home, no one wants to move there, right? Like, it's not a popular place to go and live. And so there's no influx to be, or if there is, it's so minor as to not require a plan. It just needs to be adequately addressed in terms of procedurally. So these kinds of things, it means probably someone's copied and pasted, and I think everyone's been guilty of a good copy and paste, but obviously one that hasn't been properly reviewed and thought about in the context of where this particular thing is occurring. So a mitigation measure needs to be, it needs to be logical as well, and justified correctly. Of course, highlighting the need to make the ESMP part of the of contractor requirements. That's a real key thing that we often, it's not enough information is provided to the HSEC manager. They don't know which bit we need to make sure the contractor applies and which bit we need to apply as a more general approach. And they are different things. KPIs, I cannot stress. KPIs and objectives are so key to this, because we need to know what we're aiming at. When you're on the ground, you can't just say protect the environment. It doesn't help. I know that, right? That's what I'm being paid to do. But how do I do that? And what is the way I measure that I've done so? Okay. And of course, and this is fairly obvious, but we see it time after time, the roles and responsibilities for implementing parties as well. And it's not just one, and it can't just write the HSEC manager for everything. And there's different entities, some of which have multiple roles, especially for larger projects. It is hard. again, I appreciate it's hard, but these are the kinds of things to think about. And of course, poorly implemented ESIAs affects everyone in the whole sort of network of entities that are involved in a project or in a company or are impacted by their activities. So what do you do to implement them? And this is taking after the, most ESIAs will contain, right, you need to have an environmental and social management system. We call them HSECMS because an environmental and social management system does not talk about health and safety, which is a key part of what we do. It's mentioned under an ESMS usually, but it's just we don't refer to it. So we typically call it HSECMS because our department's called the HSEC department. So under a management system, and I'm really going quickly and trying to highlight broad strokes here, but more generally, an HSEC management system is designed as follows. You have policies and strategies which overlie each individual management plans. And of course, the management plans are designed or required based on the mitigation measures that have been identified. And policies and plans obviously speak to each other. The policies inform the plan. Plans will require a program. A program is the implementation over a fixed period of time. So the plan will tell you what you need to do. It might tell you the kind of time you need to do it, but not exactly when. In this year, I will be doing X. And that's what a program does. And underneath, while they're not actually part of the program, these are separate documents, you will have procedures for executing the different aspects of the plan. And the plan should refer to those procedures. Here's an example of how complicated something can be. This is for a mine with a railway and a port in West Africa. And again, the management plan is sort of the one that from the ESIA is the document that kind of says, these are all the things you need to do, but it's not the management system. I use that management plan to develop the management system. It informs it. And as you can see, there's things for social and communities, things for environmental, things for biodiversity, things for health, safety, and security, which should not be part of the HSEC's remit, but obviously is something we have to check out. So I'm 31 minutes, so I want to stop here, but I want to explain how ESS solves that problem. First one, as a company, we undertake gap analyses and due diligences, these kind of studies, which provide an ESAP. And that provides not only the things that need to be done from an ESIA perspective, but all of those other things that I've just mentioned in terms of documents and team composition, number of people over time, etc. And so that's one of the things we provide. We have a very special service, which is the only company in the world, it's very unique, we're the only company in the world that provides it, called HSEC outsourcing. And that means we provide a HSEC team, usually a young African in an African context or emerging markets context, who is from the country, so we can train them up and create that next generation of ESG leaders in emerging economies, backed up by senior people, a senior person with about 10 years of experience and a partner level one like myself, who's seen it all and gone through all the good and the bad, and then all the management system documents that are required, that don't require rather, specialists. So biodiversity action plans, resettlement action plans require specialists. They're very context specific, etc. And we provide all that management of HSEC issues as a black box. So everything to deal with HSEC comes to us, and we come up with solutions, a range of solutions, range of costs. And we tell our clients who we are part of, the organization, this is what you need to do. And we've also got another thing under development, which we're really excited about, essentially to make due diligence and gap analysis even faster with a prompted sort of approach, checklist style approach, which makes it really easy for more junior staff to be able to undertake it to international standards, as well as, because we have then all the data for the organization, auto-generating an HSEC management system. And that's actually the holy grail that we're aiming for. We haven't finished that yet, but we hope in the course of this year to have completed it and start rolling it out. And that will be a game changer, because right now it's just copying and pasting of documents, and it's slow. It requires a big back office, and we provide that service, but it's still something auto-generated will solve a lot of problems. I hope you've seen some of the value. Again, I hope that you're taking away that ESIA consultants and consultancies provide a valuable service. It's required in any case by law, and we want to work as HSEC managers with ESIA consultancies and consultants to deliver the best possible outcome for the company so that it can make money and provide, in turn, development in these emerging markets where we live. I'll leave it there. Thank you for your attention and looking forward to your questions and comments.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Adrian. Yeah, I found that a really interesting talk, and yeah, especially good to get that overview of ESIA and emerging economies. So yeah, thank you very much. So yes, it's now a chance for everybody that's joined to have their questions answered. For now, I thought I would just kick off with a question of my own. So right at the start of your talk, Adrian, you were talking about how you were recommending people to get involved in this work in emerging economies. And yeah, I wondered if you had any advice for anyone that might be considering making that move, kind of how to do that in the best way. And also you discussed at some point one of the issues being having an external consultant bias. So I wondered if there were some suggestions you might have of how to kind of overcome that challenge and make that move in the most sort of considered way.
Yeah, look, two really good questions. The first one's really easy. Just let me know and I'll help. There's there is such a demand for people on the continent. We have lots of young, motivated Africans in Africa, and in emerging markets, there are young people who are motivated. But what's really important is that there's a sharing of different points of view. I'm an immigrant. I'm from Australia, a country of immigrants. Immigration is responsible for looking at different viewpoints, and of course, living in an African context and an emerging market context is not as easy as living in a Western context. That's a given. Otherwise, it would be Western, right? It would be, and don't forget, Africa is the West. Everyone in Africa has a very similar way of thinking as Western principles. So it's an exciting continent to move to and to do things in. Obviously, there's countries which are difficult, more difficult than others. And so, but I would recommend to go to a difficult country where there's not many people and contribute and share your skills and help to encourage the next generation of ESG leaders to come into existence. And for me, that's my passion, and that's what I hope I'm inspiring others to have that passion. And of course, the beautiful thing about being in an emerging market is there's everything to be done, and you can be involved in that. And you can not just involved in terms of as a consultant or as something, you can actually go and create these companies yourself. I do lots of different things. I've helped to set up a development bank. I've helped to, a safari park and things like this. It's so exciting to be part of those things. And I really encourage people to have that business mentality, because if you come into this with a business mentality, you will only give advice that businesses want to hear. Unless you tell them your business model is terrible and it will not work, in which case you shouldn't be doing their study for them either. Right? So it's a really exciting area to be in. And then in terms of sort of the bias question, look, at the end of the day, if you don't live in the country, you're not necessarily the best person to be able to tell people what to do, right? And I think there's a lot of that in general, because we're coming in, and it's done with the best of intentions. There's no one coming in saying you should do things like that. Another thing to bear in mind, of course, is that sometimes people, especially in companies or people from emerging markets, they don't know what they don't know, right? So you're coming in telling them something. Maybe they'll tell you it won't work here, but I've had a lot of people telling me this won't work here, and then suddenly it started magically working, right? Everyone just had to wrap their head around it first. So there's a very fine line between coming in and being the colonialist, telling people what to do, and finding in a collaborative and culturally sensitive manner, ways in which you can solve problems. And I think that's always going to be the thing that people want to see. So that means working with people on the ground and understanding not just the consultancies, but the people themselves, sitting in the villages for a while, not just going there for a little village trip, understanding their context, right? And I think that's the most important thing to address that bias.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, Adrian. Yeah, another thing to ask you about. So throughout your talk, you mentioned a few different examples of where perhaps things have not quite been done in the best manner in terms of the ESIA process. And I wondered if you might be able to mention maybe an example, a particular case study that you've worked on that had a really strong ESIA process, just to illustrate a positive example of a project.
Yeah, thanks for asking for positive examples, because I'm constantly asked for bad examples and it gets tiring of giving bad examples. So, but there are not a huge number of positive ones to pick from. Thankfully, I've been very lucky that I have worked on some of the biggest projects and also some of the most progressive. And so one that I would happily recommend was for what is now owned by the gold mining company Resolute, an Australian company, but previously was owned by an English company called Toro Gold. And the leaders of that organization were very, very proactive, and they understood that environmental and social issues were going to be a real big part of their project. And the reason was because they were situated directly next to the buffer zone of the Maniscalco National Park, which is one of the largest national parks in Africa. And so it was a complicated place. And of course, you would have some serious pushback from NGOs, communities, and so forth. And they spent a lot of money up front on the studies that are required for the ESIA process on their own behalf. And they hired a company I worked for previously here who did a fantastic job. I led part of that, and others in the team did a fantastic job of bringing that to life. They were advised by an excellent environmental and social manager who at the time who took them through the whole project. So having that person with the same vision and the whole company had the same vision was really key to that. It's easy to work with a company that sets itself up, its business model up, to avoid issues. That's as simple as that. If the company is set up in a way to avoid issues, magically there are very few issues. Now, of course, a gold mine is clearly going to have some impacts. It was an area with lots of chimpanzees, potential for other large mammals and so forth. And so a lot of studies were done up front, and they engaged with investors. And thankfully, they had a whole bunch of investors who trusted them and saw that they were passionate about it. And I mean, they sold their projects at the top of the bull market in gold for a lot of money and did a fantastic job. And it's still considered to be, the partners of, they gave money to the park and other NGOs who are working in the park to support biodiversity protection. If you set it up in a way where people are and entities are incentivized to not complain, they will not complain because the issues have been addressed. So as you can see, a lot of this has to do, and of course, as an ESIA consultant, you don't have that conversation. It's done at a bigger level than you, right? Which is why I encourage people to move to Africa and become that person who has that conversation.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Adrian. Yeah, really useful to get that that insight from you. So thank you very much. Okay, so we're actually coming up to time today, so I think I'll leave it at that for the questions. I'd just like to say to you, Adrian, thank you once again for presenting. It's been a really fascinating talk from you, and yes, hopefully everyone who's attended has learned a lot from the session today. So yes, thank you to everyone who's joined. For those of you who are IES members, don't forget to log into the members area and mark your attendance at this webinar down as part of your CPD. So just to highlight as well that the webinar has been recorded, and we'll be adding it to our website and our YouTube channel shortly. So if you're watching that recording on YouTube, please do subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be notified when we add new content, and you can do that by just hitting the bell icon as well. All right, one last thing to mention is that our next event will be held next Wednesday. So that is a webinar on the 1st of March that will be discussing the impact of land use on marine environments. So do take a look at our website if you're interested in registering for that one as well. All right, and lastly, just to say thank you once again, Adrian, and to everybody that has attended. And yeah, thank you for watching.
Thank you very much. I can't stress enough how wonderful IES, and as a previous volunteer at IES, way back when I was a younger fella, really stress that it's an organisation that truly has environmental, at heart of everything it does, and it's been a hugely useful thing for me in my career and in my life. So really appreciate the opportunity to do this webinar and to contribute.